In 2022, I met representatives of the Kremlin for a secret talk in Moscow. And they asked me this question. They asked how to deal with crazy politicians who lost the ground of reality. He has no idea what really happens on the ground. And I answered, you cannot deal with those kind of people, with this kind of people. It's impossible. They have to, they have to be kicked out of the business. We need a new elite. And this is a project for 20, 25, 30 years.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking once again to Patrik Baab, one of Germany's best and most critical international journalists. Mr. Baab is the author of the German language best-selling book On Both Sides of the Front. It's appeared only in German, but that would be the translated title. And in this book, he shares his experiences traveling to the Donbas. He also worked for many years as an editor for the North German Broadcasting Company, NDR, and he used to work as a lecturer at the two different universities. Patrick, welcome back.
Hello, Pascal, and thank you for inviting me to your channel. It's a great honor for me.
Well, it's great having you, and it's great having you in English. The last talk we did was in German, and then it was translated. But this time we said we do it the other way around, and we said we want to focus a bit on the Donbas and the local level within this conflict, because as we talked about via email, my interpretation is that we have at least three different conflicts going on, right? On one level, we have a large structural war between USA, NATO, and Russia. Then we have a bilateral kind of a bilateral hot shooting war between Russia and Ukraine. But then on the third level, we also have a civil war, or had a civil war inside Ukraine in these Donbas regions, right? That was going on for a long time. And you've been working a lot with the Donbas. Could you, you told me in the email exchange though that you see at least five conflicts. Could you tell me how you see these levels?
Yes, Pascal, I think the regional level is extremely combined with the geopolitical level. And I see five different levels of conflict that are culminating in a historical collusion in the Ukraine war. The war has now entered its fourth year, and I see five wars in one. Firstly, the Ukrainian civil war up from 2013. Then the war between Ukraine and the separatist republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, and from 2022, the Russian Federation as well. Thirdly, the proxy war of the United States, the NATO, and the European Union against Russia. The fourth point is the global economic war over the decline of the West. For example, the unipolar world with the United States as a hegemon, and the emerging BRIC states striving for a multipolar world. And fifthly, the war of the Western elites against their own people, the class war. Every war is a class war as well. If you want, I can explain that, because the first point is very interesting, and it is underestimated in Western propaganda media and Western politics. The civil war in Ukraine began at the latest with the coup on the Maidan. This coup was planned long in advance and orchestrated by the United States, by NATO and the European Unions, and this violates the UN Charter's ban on intervention. The West was in cahoots with Ukrainian ultra-nationalists and fascists. These Galician ultra-nationalists and fascists brought militant demonstrators and thousands of weapons on the Maidan, to the Maidan. Previously, arms depots and police stations in Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Ternopil had been looted. According to their own statements, they wanted to start a civil war if the Maidan failed, as Nikolai Petru, who you know very well, found out. The right sector was responsible for the murders on the Maidan. Around 100 people were killed. This is because the snipers were in the buildings that the right sector had occupied. This is shown by the detailed investigations of Professor Ivan Kachanovsky from the University of Ottawa. Immediately after the coup, a wave of violence rolled through the whole country, particularly in eastern Ukraine, where people of Russian origin lived. There were violent attacks with many deaths in Odessa, Mariupol, Zaporozhye, and other cities. This led to the formation of self-defense militias in eastern Ukraine, which obtained weapons because the police and militias showed solidarity with them, and armed units defected. The central government in Kiev relied on violence from the outset and launched the so-called anti-terror operation against the insurgents up from April 6, 2014. And this marked the beginning of a fight against the population in Donbas, in which at least 14,000 people, including 3,400 civilians, were killed by 2022, before the Russian attack. And this violates the UN Charter's prohibition of the use of force and makes it possible to speak of an attempted genocide. The insurgents responded by proclaiming the republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. And these secessions were confirmed by two referendums in May 2014. Such a secession of a part of a country is also possible under international law against the will of the central government. The West had also accepted this in Kosovo. The establishment of the independent republics of Donetsk and Lugansk marks the end of the civil war process. The second stage began at the end of April 2014, the phase of the war between Ukraine as a warring party on the one side and the republics of Lugansk and Donetsk, which were supported economically, politically, and indirectly, also militarily, by the Russian Federation. Former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg also confirmed this to the European Parliament on September 7, 2023. By contrary to what Stoltenberg said, no Russian troops were involved until February 2022. There were volunteers around Igor Girkin, for example, with the nickname Strelko. There were Wagner mercenaries, but no regular units. The Minsk Agreement was an attempt to give Ukraine some breathing space, because Ukraine units were encircled by insurgents near Debaltseve in the winter 2014 to 2015, and to give Kiev time to rearm, as former German Chancellor Merkel and former French President Hollande explained. It was never honored by the Ukrainian side. In February 2022, Russia also abandoned the Minsk Agreement and intervened directly by invading Ukraine. This marked the beginning of the second part of the war between Ukraine on the one hand and the republics of Donetsk and Lugansk and the Russian Federation on the other side. The third level is the proxy war between the United States, NATO, and EU and Russia. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Trump's special envoy Keith Kellogg now speak of a proxy war, as did former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. As economists Jeffrey Sachs and many other historians such as Richard Sakwa, Nikolai Petro, and Keith van der Peel confirm, the United States has been trying to pull Ukraine into the Western economic orbit and to arm it militarily as a bulwark against Russia since its independence in 1991. The aim was to exploit Ukraine's natural resources. The aim was to exploit Ukraine's national resources and to encircle Russia. This was intended to consolidate the United States' hegemonic position, because in a unipolar world, there can only be one leading power, Washington. The leading power sets the rules, Everybody else has to submit. The United States has lost this battle. In February 25, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio acknowledged that we live in a multipolar world. Negotiations are now taking place in Riyadh, but not just for peace in Ukraine alone, rather than the claims are being staked out worldwide. The fourth level is the global economic war waged by the West against the BRICS states, which are led by Russia and China. The West has also lost this battle. The 15 sanctions packages to date, with a total of 30,000 sanctions, I think, were aimed at isolating Russia, but they proved to be a boomerang. Without cheap Russian oil and gas, the German economy in particular is no longer competitive. Same with the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, for which the journalist Seymour Hersh blames his own country, the United States. The energy trap has snapped shut for Germany. The sanctions are having no effect. The Russian economy is surprisingly robust, and the 193 nations in the United Nations General Assembly, only 40 have joined the sanctions, while 153 continue to cooperate with Russia. It is not Russia that is isolated, it is the West. The European Council on Foreign Relations wrote, "United West divided from the rest." Meanwhile, Russia is expanding its economic relations with Asia. New nuclear-powered icebreakers are being built in St. Petersburg. I saw that to make the Northern Passage navigable for tankers all year round. New pipelines are being built to China. New railroad lines are being built between the Caspian and the Black Seas. On a global scale, economic power is gradually shifting away from Europe and the United States to Southeast Asia. More than 3 billion people live there. The United States and Europe's share of value creation is declining, while China, in particular, is becoming even stronger economically. The United States is trying to stabilize its economy at the expense of the Europeans. As a result, Europe is becoming a backyard of Washington, but also the backyard of Russia, which will not be able to reverse its turn towards Asia. The fifth level affects the taxpayers in NATO countries, especially in Europe, employees, and pensioners, and the middle class as a whole. The European Union, the United States, and Germany have financed the war in Ukraine with hundreds of billions. The reconstruction will cost hundreds of billions as well, and more money is being spent on armaments. This money is missing from consumption, social security, pensions, educations, and infrastructure. This is not military Keynesianism, because John Maynard Keynes' ideas were aimed at strengthening the population's demand. As you can see, the war in Ukraine is also a war waged by governments and corporations against their own people. The war is a raid against the middle class and the poor, and it deprives them of billions and feeds the military-industrial complex in the United States. It's a class war. These are the five levels of war I see in Ukraine.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive and also very well prepared overview that you're giving us. And I know I said we're going to talk about the Donbas mostly, but because of what you just said, I just need to ask you. Um, One of the things that really flabbergasts me now is that after all of this failed sanctioning of Russia, and after all this bloodbath that we have seen, and Europe being willing and ready to ruin itself in the process, we are now at a point where the United States also tries to to scavenge and to exploit Europe even more, right? Putting tariffs also on the Europeans who already lost their lifeline, their energy lifeline to Russia, and of course the mineral deal with Ukraine, which is the most cruel thing and most neo-colonial enterprise that I have seen in my life, like put on a European state, right? We've seen it with the Europeans doing it to Africa and doing it to Asia. We've not, I cannot remember that somebody tried to do something like this, kind of forcing a state to give up all of its wealth in perpetuity to a great power in Europe. It seems to me that this war was not just directed against Russia; it's also directed against Europe, at least from the US side. Or how do you see it?
This is absolutely correct. And responsible in Europe are transatlantic corrupted elites. They made their careers in serving the United States more than in serving their own countries. And they were promoted by the government of the United States. For example, Annalena Baerbock. She had to show up in Washington at a think tank, and they had to provide their political position, to explain their political position. And then she was sent back to get foreign minister in Germany. So all the political elites in Europe are part of a global political elite, which are far from serving their own countries.
Is this a result of the way that Europe basically the European Union kind of developed, and the way that the European continent started developing these supranational organizations like the EU and the international organizations like NATO, where suddenly positions become available, where individuals can be more powerful or more important, and the elites can be more important inside the institutions than inside their own countries, just as it would be impossible for any kind of Estonian former prime minister to suddenly take a major role in European affairs without, if it wasn't for the EU. And that these institutions, though, are all tethered to the United States and controlled, of course, ultimately with power lying in Washington.
Yes, I think so. This is one level. And the other level is American soft power.
Ah, yeah.
A lot of German elites and European elites as well were educated at transatlantic organizations and foundations like German Marshall Fund, Young Global Leaders, or the foundations of the billionaire Soros, Renaissance Foundation, and there are hundreds of foundations of that kind. They were not forced. They get offers. They get transatlantic invitations to scientific meetings, research journeys, and all that. They were promoted to jobs in Atlantikbrücke. And these organizations are aligned with state interests, think tanks, and non-government organizations who are financed indirectly by the government. And this forms a huge ideological apparatus of all levels, not only the EU level or the state level. Under the state level, you have a lot of non-government organizations. And those non-government organizations that are paid by the states are providing jobs for young academics. And that's the whole secret. It's open to your eyes. You just have to see it.
it's ideological colonialism and
Yes,
fostering for 40, 50 years, these
yes.
generations, right? And just distribute the money and but make sure that they ideologically remain online. And if people jump out like Ulrike Gero and so on, they of course they'll never seen again within these structures, right?
Yes, my friend Ulrike was part of this ideological apparatus. But one day she began to doubt. And from one day to the other, she became an outsider.
Yeah.
From one day to the other, she had no friends anymore
And
in the apparatus.
she used to be on all of these talk shows in
Yes,
Germany, right? In the biggest ones, in the most important ones,
yes.
and gone. Those times are gone because not online anymore, ideologically. Therefore, you're dropped like a hot potato.
And that's an interesting point because the propaganda media, the mainstream media, are completely aligning with NATO propaganda
Hmm.
and the narratives of the security apparatus. This is what media science shows.
Yeah.
And you can see it everywhere. And Ulrike is just one very good example. And the crucial point, from my point of view, was the second Iraq War in 2003, when the then Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, the French President Chirac, and the Russian President Putin denied to align with the United States and to attack the Iraq. And then Washington spoke from the old Europe and the new Europe. And this was a warning signal for the American elites. They wanted to re-educate the European elites. This shouldn't happen anymore again. That was the
Well,
main point.
well, this is I mean, all of this plays together. It just means that there's no easy cure for it because this ideological colonialism is, of course, now deep in the bones of Europe. But that also explains why
Yes.
Europe is now so shaken, why all of these people do not understand what happened to them. Um, but maybe look, we should focus a little bit on the Donbas because you actually spend a lot of time there, right? And you went there many times, and I really burned to know more about your experiences, how the Donbas was living before, how the Donbas is doing now, and when were you there for the last time?
Well, the last time I was there last year in October,
Mm.
and
2024, October.
24. And at the moment, I'm writing a book on that. And I've been in the Donbas several times and in the Ukraine several times. And I've been in Russia countless times since 1998. My book, Both Sides of a Front, is based on two of these trips. Well, this is a long story. I've been working for North German public broadcaster since 1997. And there was a magazine for events around the Baltic Sea, the so-called Baltic Report. And for this program, the editor-in-chief sent me to Russia, among other places, the Baltic and Scandinavia. It was actually a touristic program, but I made films about Russian neo-Nazis, about illegal oil transports, about the illegal trade in EU passports, about the sinking of the Kursk and all that. And that gave me contacts to Russian colleagues and to many people in Russia and in Ukraine. And so I learned to research in Russia, to find sources of my own. And this made my work in Donbas possible. And that's why I also knew that the way the Western media portray the war in Ukraine is essentially NATO propaganda. And we have to keep in mind that this war is taking place on three levels. The first level is the military conflict on the ground. The second the second is the economic warfare against Russia. And the third point is the propaganda war. And the media are not neutral in this propaganda war, but a party of the war. That's an important point. And my main impressions are completely different from all that what the media provide on disinformation, I have to say. They don't inform.
No, but they did a very good job at doing their propaganda because
Yes.
Soviet propaganda in the Soviet times was easy to pinpoint for Soviet citizens, at least as far as I know from the readings about those times, and
Yes.
also the jokes that went around and so on. But Western propaganda is almost is there's not a lot of people that identify it. I mean, anyone watching this program, anyone watching some of the other programs does, but I would say that probably around 80%, 70 to 80% in Europe, they believe that the general framework of what you get in ARD, ZDF, all of the German broadcasting companies, more or less is accurate with some issues. They do not comprehend the how deep the misguiding went or the narrative control went. How does the Donbas, for instance, can you give us a few examples of how the Donbas was portrayed in the West versus what is actually reality there?
Yes, 80% of the German population want to believe. That's the point.
Mm.
And this is far from reality. I can explain that in detail.
Please.
The, the propaganda media omit the prehistory of the war and the actual reasons for the war by ignoring the coup of the Maidan and the responsibility of NATO and the United States. They do not look at the social situation of the population in Ukraine. They misrepresent the military situation and behave immorally because their warmongering is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. They misjudge the mood of the population in Ukraine and in Donbas. They conceal the cultural genocide, the reprisals against the Orthodox Church, the book burnings, the destruction of monuments of Russian poets, the pronounced cult of Bandera and fascism. They do not provide information about the boomerang effect of the sanctions and the economic war against Russia, which the West is in danger of losing. They do not provide information about the geopolitical interests of the United States, which has been dividing the European region, the Eurasian region, for more than 100 years, and wants to prevent close cooperation between Russia and Germany. In particular, the attempt by the US neocons and the Biden administration to preserve the unipolar world order with the United States as a hegemon, and therefore to weaken Russia through a war in Ukraine in order to then turn to China as the main opponent. They play down the danger of nuclear conflict. They share the apocalypse blindness of our politicians. The mainstream media in all NATO countries align themselves with NATO propaganda like metal filings with a magnet. They share the neo-colonial perspective of the security state and spread anti-Russian and racist warmongering. All media research show this. They don't inform, they misinform, they disinform. Damn poor job. And my experiences on the ground are completely different. Well, for me, it was not the first time I was in a war zone. Up from 99, I was in the Balkans, in Kosovo, and I worked in Afghanistan. And I learned how to deal with danger. For example, in a region where there is a risk of mines, you are never allowed to pee in the ditch. You have to go behind the car because in the ditch there can be mines. But this war is much tougher than anything I've seen before. Drones, computer-controlled artillery, and artificial intelligence have totally changed the war. The average survival time of an infantryman on the front line, as soldiers report, was only 4 hours in Bakhmut. Only 4 hours.
Jesus.
I saw Mariupol in September 2002. The city was destroyed by, I estimate, 80%. Many people were living in basements. Nevertheless, Russia is not waging a war against the civilian population. The figures show that. No one is alive from body count. But the United States has registered around 20,000 civilian victims so far. I think there are much more. Many are not identified so far. But this war, But this is the lowest number of civilian casualties compared to all major wars since 1914. Whatever, whatever Russia wants to achieve with this war, it does not intend to annihilate the Ukraine population.
One just needs to compare the death count of civilians that you just gave in
Yes,
Ukraine and Russia as well, and in the Kursk region, and compare that to the deaths in Gaza. I mean, that one
yes,
to me is like as obviously genocidal as it gets. And if you the crazy thing is that the Europeans support a the Europeans keep saying, "Oh no, there's no genocide going on in Gaza," and the ICJ case by South Africa against Israel is ludicrous, is what they're saying. And on the other hand, they are
yes.
supporting a genocide case at the ICJ by Ukraine against Russia. Um, this is yeah, it's another level of trying to make reality what you want it to be. But I agree with you. I mean, Russia is first and foremost fighting the military of Ukraine, the
Yes.
armed forces, these different groups that were integrated.
The figures show that, and this is really a special military operation against the Ukrainian government and against NATO on the ground of the Ukraine. That's the point. And I have to say, also German tanks are rolling in the Donbas again today. I have not experienced any hostility towards Germans. Quite the opposite. The people make clear distinctions between the people and their governments, according to the motto, governments come and go, people will remain. But at the checkpoints in the war zone, this is completely different. I've been checked several times at gunpoint and arrested several times. I was detained. My German passport identifies me to the soldiers as a member of an enemy state.
Hmm.
Then I was filtered, so-called filtered. That means I was detained and questioned for many hours. So far,
By
this is all
Russians
good.
in Russian.
Yes, absolutely, by Russians, by Russian troops. So, and well, in front of the guns. And so far, this all went well. But in a war zone where thousands have died, a human life is no longer worth much. Then I had to realize that the majority of the people in Donbas do not feel occupied by the Russian army, but liberated. Some of the soldiers were welcomed with open arms. It is hard to imagine in the West and contradicts NATO propaganda, but it is explainable. In Donetsk and Lugansk, the population has been shelled by the Ukrainian army since April 2014. I've experienced this many times. After more than 10 years of shelling by Ukrainian artillery, it should come as no surprise that people see their future on the Russian side. Wages are 3 times higher in Russia. There are a higher, there is a higher standard of living. In cities such as Mariupol or Zaporozhye, fascist units such as the Azov Battalion have been harassing, beating, threatening, and arresting the civilian population since 2014. Eyewitnesses have told me that many times. Because the civilian population was subjected to reprisals, they welcomed the Russian army as liberators. That's easy to explain.
Can I can I ask you about something here? Because the Donbas is of course one of the essential building blocks of this horrible war, or one of the things that kept the escalation spiral then turning. But something that our media also always forgets and never mentions is that for 8 years between 2014, when these two Donetsk and Lugansk, these two regions oblasts first said we want to be independent, until 2022, until like 3 or 4 days before the special military operation, the whole strategy of Russia was to keep them in there. Russia did not recognize their these regions' declarations of independence. They said like, no, the final goal as stated in the Minsk agreements, is to keep you inside Ukraine and federalize Ukraine and make sure the Ukraine without Crimea remains as it is. That was the whole strategy, which is a smart strategy from Russia. And you've visited the place before that, before 2022, and then after it. Can you tell me if something changed on the ground of how people also like thought about their future and themselves in as people of Lugansk, people of Donetsk, and what they were aiming for?
So I think nothing changed. The outcome of the Ukrainian shelling, of the shelling by the Ukraine army for years over years, for 8 years as a whole, drew the people in Donbas closer to the Russian side. And the general opinion I heard is the Kremlin came too late. They had to help us in 2014 and not in 2022. We waited, we waited too long. Putin came too late. This was a mistake.
That's what you're
That's
hearing about
yes,
the feelings in the Donbas.
many times, yes, many times. Because people say, we see our children die. And the only possible help can come from Russia. And the living standard in Russia is much higher as in Ukraine. And there is no language difference. Many people in Russia have relatives in Donbas because this was an important industrial region in the Soviet Union. And many people in the Donbas have relatives in Russia, in St. Petersburg, in Kazan, in Moscow, in Rostov-na-Donu. So the relationships are very close. And they know each other, how they live. They know how they live on both sides of the border. So, and you have to understand all the regions eastward from the Dnieper came to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1922 because the central government of the Bolshevists in Moscow wanted to create a unique zone of administration for making the Dnieper navigable and for building a great hydraulic power plant near Zaporozhye, which worked up from 1932. And this was the background. So these were Russian people, not Ukrainians.
But when you were there before 2022, did you ever ask them whether they felt Ukrainian or Russian, or whether they felt both? And did that change also through the war? I suppose it must have.
No, it changed long before the war. In the time after the Maidan coup, and it changed step by step in the years 2014 to 2015 and 16. A woman told me, we were Ukrainians as well. Why did they shoot us? Why shoot us? Why did they shoot us and our children? Now, I hope for peace with Russia, on the aligning with Russia. That's the point.
Yeah, if you use that much violence against the local population, you cannot hope to win their hearts.
Exactly.
The same
Yes.
thing is unfortunately true in reverse. I mean, there's no way that Russia can hope that the Galicians and the Western Ukrainians will
Yes.
ever love them because, well,
Yes. Yes. And Russia don't want to conquer the Western Ukraine. They don't want that. And from my point of view, the Ukraine will be divided in two, probably in three parts. The regions eastward of the Dnieper will be Russian territory, and the rest will be a neutral country. There is a possibility that Poland will occupy Galicia because Galicia belonged to Poland between the Great Wars, up from 1919 to 1939.
Although what we are recently hearing from Poland is that they are rather worried about the number of Ukrainians inside their current borders. So it seems that the current government is not keen on actually integrating even more Ukrainians
Yes,
into their nationalistic view of what Poland should be. Um,
yes, that's right. That's right. But there are strong relations between Poland and Western Ukraine, many friendships, but also historic hostilities, because Ukrainian fascists killed in the years 43 and 44 up to 100,000 Poles in a very crucial way. So there are mixed feelings in Poland. I heard in Poland the people say, we are helping the Ukrainians. Yeah, they helped us as well. They helped us to die.
these nobody must underestimate the level of animosity within the European continent against each other, right?
Yes.
Which brings me to this question, the European Union, for all of its flaws and all of its mistakes, has done has done a miracle to bring France and Germany together, and another two states that historically loved killing each other, right? The European Union also had solved quite a few problems. Let's not forget that. I mean, it basically also helped solve the Northern Irish conflict, and as a couple of conflicts just by Europeanizing the states, the conflicts went away. Now, in this case, it did the exact opposite. It made it worse. Can you explain to yourself why the European Union not only failed so miserably, but actually did the opposite of being a peace project?
That's an interesting point. I think the European Union is approaching this conflict, this war, incorrectly. They want to prolong the war and to drive their own population even deeper into this war in Ukraine. And I think we are governed by gamblers who knowingly accept the risk of a nuclear war in Europe. And well, you have to keep in mind, Russia is the most strongest nuclear power of the world. And if Moscow comes under pressure, Russia will use the atomic bomb. And as the New York Times reports, General Surovikin, the former commander, the Russian commander in the Kherson Oblast, was already considering this in 2023. And we, we have already narrowly avoided a nuclear war, a nuclear inferno several times in this Ukraine war. And the reason for this warmongering among the political elites in the European Union, that was your question, is they want to distract from their own failures. They have ruined their own countries, economically and politically, through the war and through the sanctions. They have maneuvered themselves into a dead end. This applies especially to Germany. Therefore, no, the propaganda is intended to shift the focus of aggression. That's the main point. The people's anger over the grievances in their own countries is being diverted onto an external enemy, Russia. This is how the Western political elites want to gain time to continue governing. That's the point. And the European Union has completely failed as a peace project. You mentioned that. and degenerated into a war machine. Decisions are being made in the European Parliament that Russia can only understand as a declaration of war. This could actually lead to a nuclear catastrophe. We have now arrived in a kakistocracy, the rule of the worst. They are gradually abolishing democracy to secure the rule of the traditional party cartels. As for Donbas, it will not return to Ukraine. Russia won the war and now wants its demands met. Ukraine is being divided, I explained that. The longer the war lasts, the less of Ukraine will remain, the more people will be killed. The cynicism of European politicians is also responsible for this. The European Union could have and should have prevented this war, but neither Berlin nor the EU initiated a single peace initiative. This means that in addition to the military defeat and economic decline, there is also complete moral bankruptcy on the side of our politicians.
Isn't it even worse? These people kept saying, "We want peace. We will bring peace through weapons." Weapons are the way to peace. They don't understand. They don't have the mental capacity to
Yes,
comprehend that what they're doing is to make the war worse. Instead of using peaceful means to get to peace, they want to use war means to get to peace. And how do
absolutely.
you deal with people who are that ignorant? Because this is a problem also to military strategists. Because if you assume that the other side is rational, then you can try to think yourself into their shoes. But if you have to understand that these people are complete morons, then how do you deal with that?
In 2022, I met representatives of the Kremlin for a secret talk in Moscow. And they asked me this question. They asked how to deal with crazy politicians who lost the ground of reality. He has no idea what really happens on the ground. And I answered, you cannot deal with those kind of people. With this kind of people, it's impossible. They have to, they have to be kicked out of the business. We need a new elite. And this is a project for 20, 25, 30 years. And if you have a look at the academic elites in Europe as a whole, especially in Germany, in the university, in the schools, in the churches, in the political sphere, in the media, they all are thinking in the same way. So the complete academic elite in Western Europe has gone mad. That's the point. Well, in such a moment, I'm remembering a sentence of William Shakespeare. "'Tis the time's black when madmen lead the blind." And that's the political situation. And this is very dangerous.
This is this is extremely dangerous. But we won't get them out. I mean, you can see right now how the kakistocracy, how these people try to make sure that all potential opposition from within is being eliminated, right? In Romania, now recently in France, I've had a talk with a Polish journalist who told me in Poland too. The opposition is basically being kept down also through judicial measures, and if this continues, then there's not much hope for Europe because it will ruin itself, obviously, but it will do so while remilitarizing, which is even more dangerous, isn't it?
It is absolutely the case. Europe is ruining itself, and this will take a bad end because we are becoming the backyard of the United States and the Russian Federation as well. So we are falling back in the international development. And we have a great shift to Southeast Asia in economic power, a shift in economic power. And we are losing our ground. And People don't see that. They have lost the ground of reality in Western Europe.
If you were 28, but you know what you know today, I mean, with all the experiences, would you stay in Germany and try to make a living there, or would you actually leave?
No, I would leave the country. I would go probably to Switzerland, probably to Singapore or Hong Kong, probably to the Russian Federation, to St. Petersburg. I would not stay in Europe because I see the decline in Europe, the decline economically, politically, the decline in liberties. We are losing the ground of democracy. Today we are living in Germany in a kind of facade democracy, nothing else.
Do you think that there's some mechanisms to repair this? I mean, in theory, democracies should be able to, once they really run in the wrong direction, the population starts understanding that they're suffering and they then elect opposition parties into power, and therefore you can then start correcting course. And I mean, Germany has a large opposition party, which is the AfD, right? And they used to have in parliament on the left side the Ms. Wagenknecht, but they didn't manage to get in again. But there is opposition. But will this opposition grow?
I think this opposition will grow, and there are two possibilities. In Germany, we have two parties who are oriented at peace with Russia, the AfD and the BSW, the Sarah Wagenknecht party. And those parties should, from my point of view, closely cooperate to achieve peace with Russia. If they don't do that, the AfD will come into a turnaround to a transatlantic political right-wing group to bring the people in Germany under pressure by gaining a government possibility to cut social security expenses and so on. And so this would be the wrong way from my point of view. On the other hand, people have to demonstrate for peace. They have to bring their interest in peace onto the streets. But in Germany, people don't do that. Well, responsible for the catastrophe is not only that one who is causing the catastrophe, but also that one who don't want to do something against this process.
Yeah. Can I ask you, and this is also quite difficult, but something that occupies me a lot at the moment, like mentally, is this question about surrender or a capitulation. I believe very strongly one of the things that saved Japan from suffering the same fate as Korea was because Japan was able to surrender. It was able to do what was unthinkable only months before. Germany, of course, famously didn't surrender, and the Russians went all the way to the bunker, right? And they took Berlin, and it destroyed the country, and it split it up into four and then two pieces for 40 years. It was horrible, horrible. But after this experience in Germany, that you were forced to surrender and you were forced to um, turn around 180 degrees and accept that no, the Nazi regime was an evil regime and it did the most horrible things. And today Germany accepts that, right? Every German accepts that never ever again they would want that. But it is unthinkable that again, like surrender might be the way toward peace. Can you explain to yourself why that is that the word that surrender and is not a concept in Europe at the moment in order to get to peace?
Well, I agree with Professor Glenn Deason of the University of South Norway. He said the only way to bring peace to Ukraine is the, the West NATO, the United States, and Brussels have to accept the Russian demands
Mhm. Surrender.
because Russia is surrender. Exactly. Because the Russians will continue to fight until Ukraine will confirm that this country stays neutral. This is the main point. And the Western elites don't accept that because their own careers are very close to the warmongers in the United States of the Democratic Party. They don't follow Donald Trump. They want to hide themselves and to survive in the basement until Trump is gone. And they hope the war will last until Trump is gone. And they won't destroy every peace solution. It is, on the one hand, a psychological problem. They are in a narcissistic way dysfunctional. It's a dysfunctional thinking. They lost the ground of reality, and they are living in a bubble of transatlantic ideology.
But Donald Trump is currently using a sledgehammer to destroy that bubble. I mean, this is gonna
Yes.
hurt. This is gonna hurt so bad. I mean, psychologically to these people. Um,
Yes.
well, we didn't talk about as much about Donbas as I wanted to, but this was very interesting, the way that we connected or you connected these different levels. Patrick, do you want to add something more?
Yes. I can tell a bit more about Donbas and, well, how the Donbas is doing today and how are the political structures today. I
Uh,
learned on the ground, uh, well, as far as the political structures are concerned, the Russian constitution applies now. And according to this, the provincial governors in the Donbas are appointed by the president himself and are directly responsible to him. This can also be seen on the ground, for example, with the head of the government of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin. As far as I can tell, he's towing the Kremlin's general line, nothing else. In the meantime, other Russian regions have taken over sponsorships. They have taken over sponsorships for the four oblasts, which have been incorporated in the Russian Federation. And this means that Russian regions are actively providing reconstruction assistance, militarily, politically, and economically. I was also told that President Putin is partly overseeing the reconstruction himself. He was in Mariupol as well and was told how the construction of new districts, new houses, and new housing estates was progressing. He's also sending representatives to monitor, for example, food prices. And it is important that all four districts, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, are still war zones. Martial law therefore applies. The military commanders are ultimately in charge. This is also reflected, for example, in the curfew. At 10 p.m. in the evening, you are no longer allowed to be on the streets without a special permit. Unlike in Russia, young men are still conscripted into the military. And my overall impression is that Donbas is ruled from Moscow, but the central government has the support of regional officials and the local people, the population. However, um, this is an exception. Between 2014 and 2022, the CIA and the Ukrainian Secret Service, SBU, tried to set up a kind of stay-behind organization in the Melitopol area. This is a secret underground army that was supposed to start a guerrilla war in the event of a Russian attack. The city of the city of Melitopol is strategically located between Russia and Crimea, halfway between the Dnieper and the Sea of Azov. And this stay behind organization has secret weapons stores and explosive stores and still carries out attacks in the Melitopol area. I spoke to a man who, as a civilian, he was an administrative manager, was the target of an attack. He lost a leg when a car bomb exploded. And I think that's interesting. And when I have to add, when I was in the Donbas in the fall of 22, some of the towns and villages were completely destroyed. Mariupol, for example, were destroyed at, I estimate, to 80%. Long queues everywhere for food distribution, stray children, homeless people, shut up houses, burnt facades, and all that. In the meantime, the infrastructure is being rebuilt, the apartment houses are being renovated. New windows have been installed everywhere in the schools, or new schools have been built. Reconstruction is creating new jobs in the Donbas. As a result, many people who fled the war are returning. Donbas is now a region of immigration. It is important to note that Russia has taken in the most refugees from Ukraine. The UN speaks of 2.8 million, but Russian authorities up to 5 million refugees. It is difficult to determine the exact number, as many people have been accommodated with relatives or have now taken Russian citizenship. Pensions have now been raised to the Russian level. I told you that. This means that pensioners have 3 times as much money in their pockets as before. This strengthens purchasing power and loyalty to the leadership as well. And many people are completely traumatized of the war. I spoke to teachers in Mariupol who teach those kind of children. They tell me when the bell rings at recess, some children crawl under the table because they think it's a bomb alert. And even if bilateral talks between Washington and the United and Moscow have given rise to optimism that the war can be ended, the war in the minds of those children will never end. That's the point. I've no seen a difference in how the Russian-speaking people and the Ukrainian-speaking people is treated. Well, especially the city of Melitopol, especially the city of Melitopol, was handed over to the Russian army without a fight. That's why there is no destruction in the city. I was in an Armenian restaurant over there, and the owners, the family, is not politically inclined towards Russia, but towards Ukraine. They have no recognizable disadvantages. They can continue to run their business. There's nothing. And
So you
even
haven't
before,
you haven't seen any systematic disadvantage
no,
of Ukrainian speaking population of now Russian controlled Donbas.
no, because this is normal in Russia. It's a multi-ethnical country.
Hmm.
It's all over Russia. It's the same thing. Different ethnics, different groups of people are living together. And this is a good sign.
Yeah.
This is a good sign. And
Um,
even before the Russian invasion, everyone in Donbas spoke Russian with a Ukrainian accent. Russian is now the official language there. The school curricula have adapted to the Russian curriculars, and teachers are trained in the Russian way accordingly. Some use Ukrainian language in everyday life, but I couldn't say that this puts them to a disadvantage. I,
okay.
I never saw that.
That's a very positive thing, and you know, I'm sorry, but we are reaching the 1 hour mark, so we do have to stop at this point. But if people want to follow you, also like English speaking audience, do you publish in English or mainly in German, or is there an outlet to go to read from you?
Yeah, you can read some articles that I've wrote in the Canadian magazine, the Post Hill magazine. the Post Hill magazine. Not so much, but some articles. Mostly I'm publishing in German language.
Okay. And I will put the links to your publishing in English and also in German into the description. Everybody
Okay.
go and read from Patrick. He really reports a lot and he thinks a lot. And I thank you very much for all the insights today.
Thanks very much. It was great talking to you.